Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Artifact Highlight from Readout Productions, where I show you the things in my history collection, or what you may also call my junk collection, depends on who you are. In this episode we're going to be talking about some photos from my wired photo collection. Now, I'm not fully certain if these are actual wired photos. What I mean by a wired photo is the process of where you use electro thingamajiggies and in the different cells of electronic things transmit through the air and somehow it brings out a photo. I don't know the full process behind it. I am not a scientist. But I don't think these are true wired photos, as in these are primarily from 1929 into 1930. And I think it was still pretty primitive back then, the wired photo process. And plus, these are clearly printouts of photo. They're first-hand copies of these photos. Now, all these photos come from the Henry Miller News Picture Service, which was located at 519 13th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. I can hardly find any information on Henry Miller News Picture Service. I know there's the Henry Miller, the author. I don't think that's the same Henry Miller. There was no mention of any photo service he was involved with for the news. If anybody knows anything about a Henry Miller News Picture Service, please let me know in the comments. Any history, any tidbits. They're a bit of a mystery. I looked online to see, put in the address, and today that is now the site, near the site of the Warner Theater in D.C. And I also know that the Henry Miller News Picture Service location was only a few blocks east of the White House, so they were very central. They were probably very central, very close to various congressional going-ons and stuff at the time. So this is going to be part one of two. I have about 14 of these photos. I've split them up into two piles. So we're going to talk about this pile today, and we'll talk about this pile in another video. So we're going to take that pile away. We're going to flip this one over. And all the photos have these little clippings on, a description of what's going on. I guess that's to tell whatever newspaper company is going to be printing these images out. So we're going to start with this very first photo here. This photo here is of Representative Leonidas C. Dyer, Mrs. Elsie J. Briley, and Representative J. Charles Littcomb at the committee to determine the bill that would make the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. So the story on how the Star-Spangled Banner became our national anthem. So you may or may not know that for over 100 years in our history as a country, we didn't have an official national anthem. Yes, Francis Scott Key wrote that famous poem back in 1814, but it really kind of, I want to say faded into obscurity, but it didn't become the anthem automatically. There were many, 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 many years where we didn't have any type of official anthem or anything. What ends up happening is, starting around 1918, the Maryland Representative John Charles Littcomb, who's pictured here on the right, he started proposing a bill at the behest of his wife, I believe it was, to make the Star-Spangled Banner into the national anthem. This went on for about a decade. He made 6 attempts to make this bill, and every time it basically was shot down. It just wasn't really, at a time, a very important bill, I suppose. And you have to think, at the time when he first proposed it, World War I was just wrapping up. Then he had the Treaty of Versailles to try to fix what had happened in Europe, and we all know that didn't help at all. And then the Roaring Twenties happened. You have the Prohibition. So I guess this wasn't, at the time, wasn't a very important bill, so it probably just kept getting back cataloged. So we flash forward to 1929, when the VFW starts getting involved. And the VFW makes a petition during Littcomb's 6th attempt to make this into law. The VFW has this petition signed. About 5 million Americans signed the petition, and it's presented to the committee that's debating the bill. Now, in the middle of the photo is Elsie J. Riley, who was the wife of the D.C. VFW post commander, deputy commander, my apologies. So she, growing up, had been a singer. She used her singing for various charities during World War I. Actually, her parents were both German immigrants, was quite interesting to point out. So we have a descendant of an immigrant proposing the Star-Spangled Banner as a bill. And what ends up happening is, when the bill's being debated in 1929, the biggest argument is that the Star-Spangled Banner is too difficult for an average person to sing. It just isn't easy to be sung. So Riley, who actually was a soprano voice, she went to the committee, was invited by Linthicum and Dyers over here, went to the committee and actually performed the rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner in a lower key than had been previously done to prove that it could be sung by a more common, more wide variety of people. And eventually, this push in 1929 was successful. In 1930, the bill passed through House, then it passed through Senate, and in 1931, President Hoover finally signed the bill into law, making the Star-Spangled Banner its first stanza, our national anthem. So here is the full photo. Now, I've seen other photos of the same image at a different angle, but I am glad to have this one at much more clear clarity. The other ones are much more fuzzy and blurry. That might just because of the internet. Moving on, our next photo, we're going to talk about this gentleman here. This guy here is Erwin B McLaughlin from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hey, my neck of the woods. He is a steel magnate who worked as the treasurer of the Jones McLaughlin Steel Company from 1900 to 1903. His background comes from his grandfather being a steel magnate, and his mother was the daughter of a federal judge, actually. Pretty interesting to point out. Now, what brings him into history is that he served as in many U.S. embassies around the world. He served in several as various treasurers and deputy secretary. Most famously, he was the second secretary to the U.S. Embassy in Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. You know, where Russia got oofed. Big time. I might want to make a construction paper battlefield video some days on some of the battles there. Yeah, before World War II, Japan was a force to be reckoned with way before World War II. You might know him for the Meridian House in Washington, D.C. It was his personal home that he had built in 1923. It was used to house his extensive collection of old French drawings and Oriental screens and porcelain. I'm assuming he got the screens and porcelain from his time over in Japan. What ends up happening during the fallout of World War I, he is made the secretary to Henry Cabot's Lodge at the first Arms Control Conference, the Washington Naval Conference, which occurred from 1921 to 22. It's the first successful arms control conference in world history. In 1924, he was sent over to Greece to be, get this word, the envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to Greece from 1924 to 26. Short answer, he was the ambassador for us to Greece. And then his most important role came when Hoover appointed him to be the American ambassador to Spain from 1929 to 1933. Now, when he first arrived in Spain in 1929, he was greeted by this gentleman over here, Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Prime Minister of Spain at the time. And at that time in history, Spain was under the dictatorship of Rivera. What ended up happening was, back in the 1920s, Spain was in a very, very bad financial mess. Rivera, military captain, decided to take over the government. He wanted to have a military established government. And actually was very successful in boosting Spain's economy. However, eventually people grew tired of being under a dictatorship, like all countries do. I mean, that's not a bad thing. We don't want a dictatorship, folks. And what ends up happening is, shortly after this photo was taken, I think in 1930, Rivera fled the country, and he actually died just like a couple weeks after he went to Paris to go into exile. He died in 1930. And what ended up happening is they tried to restore a republic, which will become the Second Spanish Republic. Unfortunately, and Lachlan actually warned of this, do not call it a republic, because there were many, many, many people still loyal to Rivera. Many, many people still like their more strict military dictatorship. Actually, one of Rivera's sons led to one of the many fascist groups in the early 30s that started revolting against the Spanish Republic, and by the late 1930s, I think you know what this is leading to, the Spanish Civil War, where the fascists take over, Spain becomes a fascist dictatorship, and we all know that this was pretty much the little proxy war before the official start of World War II. Lachlan left, however, by 1933. Our next photo, speaking of Germany, this here is the family of... Yeah, you heard me flipping the page. Oh, you're getting a good history lesson, folks. I'm sure you're still watching. This here is the family of Julius Courteous. He was the German foreign minister from 1929 to 1931. He was the last of the German People's Party to hold this position before World War II kicked off. He was an advocate for reacquiring the Rhineland. He was very pro taking the Rhineland back. However, he also supported the Young Plan, which essentially was hated by every German party. The Young Plan basically still allowed for reparations. And by this point, by the 1930s, you know what's going on in Germany. They are done with the reparations. The Depression's about to hit. You know where this is all leading to. I don't think I have to tell you. So he was growing unpopular because of that. He also supported, and I'm surprised to learn this, Courteous supported close cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union, which is a no-no later on down the road. He tried eventually to form a customs union with Austria. It was a way of trying to get around reparations. France did not like this at all, and they pulled all of their loans from Austria in protest. And this actually was one of the leading causes of bringing the Great Depression over to Europe. What ends up happening is the Depression spreads throughout Europe, and Courteous quietly steps out of power. So this is, I don't have actually a photo of Courteous, but this is his family. I was trying to research to see what happened, because I know he lived through they all lived through World War II, I believe. I don't think they had really any involvement. I think Courteous just kind of took a step back as the Nazi Party took over. And actually what ended up happening with the German People's Party, they initially opposed the Nazi Party for a good while, but then their own numbers started turning against each other, so they kind of were absorbed into the Nazi Party. I don't think Courteous was, and he just quietly stepped back and just said to whatever was going on. And I think he lived until late 40s. He lived after the war, I know that. I don't know, I was trying to see what became of his family, but I couldn't find much. Speaking of France, look at this gentleman here. This here is, let me flip the page again. This here is George Clemenceau. I apologize, I do not speak French. I know one of my friends is a French teacher, and she's probably very happy that I said that right, or very upset that I said that very wrong. I don't know which one is which. Anyways, this is George Clemenceau on his 88th birthday. He was known famously as the Tiger. He was Prime Minister of France, served 2 non-consecutive terms from 1906 to 1909, and then from 1917 to 1920. And it's kind of interesting when I was researching. We always think, the 19th century and the 20th century being these two far apart things. We view the 20th century as being very close, but the 19th century, that's ancient. But really, he started his service as a politician 5 years at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, which is a conflict I plan to cover this summer on Construction Paper Battlefield. Wait until September of this year, folks. If you know what happened in September during the Franco-Prussian War, you know what I'm going to talk about this summer. Anyways, so he took over just 5 years afterwards, and France was in a very bad state when he started working his way up for the politician ranks. He was very opposed to Germany. He wanted the land back. He wanted the economy back from what Germany had pretty much taken when Germany united at the end of that conflict. And eventually he took his first term as prime minister, he was basically warning of a conflict was inevitable with Germany. He wanted the Russians, the British to get together, to form an alliance with them, right? And at that time they were like, oh yeah, there ain't going to be another conflict. Yeah, we're beyond that now. Well, after he leaves as the prime minister, a few years later, World War I erupts. And actually, France went through 3 prime ministers in the first 3 years of the war. Every prime minister, the first mistake they made, they were out. Then came the next one. And eventually what ended up happening was the President Raymond Poincaré, who despised the Tiger, and the Tiger despised Poincaré. They were very staunchly opposed to each other, knew that Clemenceau was very popular with the people, and he was a very strong total war policies. He was going to be the backbone for the nation. So he asked for him to come back as prime minister. And basically the best way to describe Clemenceau during World War One, he was like proto-French Churchill. He was known for big speeches, I'm paraphrasing him close. We're going to fight them on the line. We're no going beyond. I'm trying to make him sound like Churchill, because that's basically what some of his speeches were like. And actually Churchill took a lot of influence from Clemenceau here. Under Clemenceau's leadership, France and the Allies sort of turned the tide of the war, and in 1918, World War I stops. I love using that term, stops. Yes, the war ends, but nothing was gained, folks, at the end. We know what World War I just causes a whole new mess for Europe by the end of it. So let's just say World War I stops. And Clemenceau would be one of the representatives at the Treaty of Versailles. And boy, did he not enjoy his time there. Actually, he almost got assassinated during his time there at the Versailles. Got shot, and actually the bullet was in his body till his death. Pretty interesting. But during his time at the Treaty of Versailles, he despised Woodrow Wilson, and he did not like the British Prime Minister, that was David Lloyd George. And he's very famous on saying that while he was sitting there, he felt like he was between Jesus Christ on the one hand and Napoleon Bonaparte on the other. He felt that the Allies were being too weak. The Allies, the reparations, he wanted higher reparations. But Clemenceau started to become the realization of something, that France's economy was destroyed because of World War I. And he knew that they could not personally oversee the reparations of Germany. So he begrudgingly gave it over to the United States and Britain to handle, which was very unpopular in France, because France we're the ones that suffer the most. Why are they the ones deciding the fate of us and Germany? And ultimately, because of this, Clemenceau was forced to step down in 1920. And eerily enough, in 1924, in his memoirs, he predicted that Europe would be going to war again with Germany by 1940. We kind of know what happened. So this photo was taken in 1929. I think he died November of that year. So this might actually be one of the final photos of Clemenceau. I hope I'm saying his name right. I don't want to lose my French audience. And this is an interesting image here. This here is of the White Pine Camp, beautiful Kirkwood Estate, Adirondack. And this was to be the summer home of Hoover. Pretty interesting. I don't know much to say. Oh, let's see what it has here. Oh, there's a Japanese tea house. Can you see that there in the distance? Yeah, Japanese tea house in New York, apparently. You can see the footbridge. There's a bowling. I think this is the bowling alley apparently over here. Oh, geez, has everything. And we'll finish off with John Hammond, who, the founder of Jurassic Park. No, not that John Hammond. This is John Hayes Hammond. And John Hayes Hammond did not find Jurassic Park, but he is one of the leading engineers in deep mining, which is basically where you dig underground. You dig your portals and go into the mine. It's probably it's been dying out the past several years. Now I think strip mining is the popular means now. He was born in California in 1855, was a supporter of the deep mining trend, and he invested in gold mine operations in Africa. One of the most important to talk about is the consolidated gold fields that were commanded by Cecil Rhodes. So what ends up happening is poor Hammond, when he makes this deal with Rhodes, gets involved in a very sticky situation. If you know 1890s Africa, it was a mess. Actually, any Africa during the latter half of the 19th century was a mess. Please see my construction paper battlefield videos on the beginnings of the Zulu War. Now, during this time, there was an uprising occurring. The Boers of the region, which were people that were living at the time in the region known as Transvaal, were starting to grow unrested. They did not like British occupation. They wanted to be their own state. The British wanted to get control back. So Cecil Rhodes decided to collaborate a plan which became known as the Jemison Raid. And this was in 1895. And the plan was to incite an uprising at one of his mining operations at Transvaal And essentially then that would make it that the British would have to send reinforcements in and have to take over the state and restore British rule. So it was pretty much, I want to call it a false flag operation. But it was almost a way just to cause this uprising. So the British like, oh, we need the British now. It backfired big time. Did not work, and was one of the leading causes of what became known as the Boer Wars, the Second Boer War in particular. Hammond, John Hammond, poor guy here, was one of the ones who were tried and claimed were conspiring and part of the whole plan. And he was arrested with several key figures, tried, and they pretty much sentenced him to death. They were to have him executed and be hung. However, things changed by 1896, and he used a good bit of his fortune to pay out his bail, and he quickly made his way back over to the United States. Then he got involved in some Mexican mines in the early 1900s before befriending President Taft, and Taft gave him a very special assignment to be a special representative of the United States at the coronation of King George V. This photo was taken just before John Hammond was awarded the Saunders Engineering Award, which was at the time, in the 1920s, was the highest award somebody can get for mine engineering. And he was eventually inducted into one of the Mine Engineering Hall of Fame. That's where I got most of this information from. So there you have it. Part 1 of my collection of Henry Miller News Service photos from 1929. It's a bit of an interesting area when you start diving into it. You're at the end of that golden age for the United States. You know, the Roaring 20s, which really weren't all that great when you consider it with Prohibition and everything. But that also made it even better, even more enjoyable time. A little risky, but more enjoyable. You're seeing the end of the golden age, I think, of the world. You're seeing that World War I's effects in Europe are pretty much being ignored by the United States, who are partying hard. And you're starting to see the cracks of the Depression occurring and what will become World War II. So I think it was a pretty I was very fascinated diving into these photos, learning some of the history. So again, I don't know if these are actual wired photos, because it was a very uncommon process at that time, or these were just first print photos that were supposed to be sold off to the newspapers. Probably more likely the case. But let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Have any particular tidbits to tell me about the photos or the events I mentioned. Leave a comment below if you want to see part 2, want to see me go through the rest of these photos. Be more than happy to. And be sure to check out some of the videos I make on Readout Productions. I do Construction Paper Battlefield. I do various movie talk videos. I do media hunting videos, which, you know, we're on hold at the moment because of the end of the world right now. And I do some various other random videos here and there. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.